Welcome to this session of Literary Criticism, where we would look into the essay The Hearsay of Paraphrase, written by Cleanth Brooks. Before that, let us give a short introduction to Brooks and New Criticism. The critic Leach mentions that in The Well-Wrought Urn, Studies in Structure of Poetry, Brooks advocates close reading because, I quote him, by making a close examination of what the poem says as a poem, unquote, a critic can effectively interpret and explicate the text. For Brooks, the core of literary criticism is that literary study be concerned primarily with the work itself. The essay, The Formalist Critic, offers, again I quote him, some articles of faith to which Brooks adheres. Leach outlines the articles mentioned by Brooks that are considered to be the tenets of new criticism. The first principal concern of criticism is with the problem of unity, where the whole is built by the relation between the various parts. Second, format and content cannot be separated in a good work of art. Third, form is meaning. Fourth, the metaphoric and symbolic representations constitute literature. Fifth, from the concrete and the particular, the general and the universal can be arrived at. Sixth, literature is not a substitute for religion. Seventh, the purpose of literature is not to teach morals. And the last, the principles of criticism define the area relevant to literary criticism. They do not constitute a method for carrying out the criticism. Brooks had formulated these guidelines in reaction to historical and biographical analysis of texts. Brooks and Warren were teaching biographical facts and impressionistic criticism which were unsuccessful in showing how poetic language differed from the language of an editorial or a work of non-fiction. Unhappy with the textbooks and the prevalent methods of criticism that were considered inappropriate to teach poetry and literature, Brooks and Warren published Understanding Poetry. They believed that poetry should be taught as poetry, and the critic should refrain from reducing a poem to a paraphrased content that explained biographical and historical details and even resorted to didacticism. Brooks and Warren's description of the poem as an organic system of relationship is a key element of new critical approaches to the text. According to the new critics, a literary artifact was primarily a system of language that operated in a different way from how it did elsewhere, being governed by a different set of rules. A poet who uses a particular word exploits its suggestive as well as literary meanings and finds out how they may sound and resonate with other words in the poem. In the literary text, similar words could be used in many contexts, and therefore the meaning of the words could change. Literary language is a non-functional language. Language is used to reflect human needs and resources which are not only utilitarian. New criticism emphasizes that the readers need to adjust their reading strategy to accommodate the difference between literary and non-literary language. John Crowe Ransom Cleanth Brooks and the other new critics pointed out that the difference between literary and non-literary language was a crucial starting point for the development of other new critical ideas. William Emerson focused on ambiguity, Ellen Tate on tension, John Crowe Ransom on the concrete universal, and Cleanth Brooks on paradox. I. A. Richards' practical criticism and Cleanth Brooks' understanding poetry are considered to be the foundational texts for new critical theory. They share the insistence on the special nature of the language of the literary artifact. The initial title considered for understanding poetry was Reading Poems. Understanding poetry was considered to be a better title because it indicated that there was a principle of reading poetry that must be learned, whereas reading poetry would suggest developing strategies for approaching individual poems. The pivotal new critical texts include William Emerson's 7 Types of Ambiguity, published in 1930, the 1949 The Well-Wrought Urn by Cleanth Brooks, Ellen Tate's Essays of 4 Decades in 1974, and William Wimsatt's The Verbal Icon in 1954. Let's move on to the formulations of Brooks. Brooks is primarily concerned with poetic language, which is special and characterized by the employment of paradox, irony, wit, ambiguity, dramatization of experience, organic interrelationship, and complexity. He expresses his concern about the deteriorating condition of poetry. Language and society, Brooks argues, are interdependent and complementary to each other, and the decay of modern society without values and a culture without direction would affect language. Brooks finds both language and society to be in a chaotic state. The power of literature, says Brooks, lies in the ability to discard the old and the dead from the language. Let's move into what Brooks has to say about the nature and function of poetry. Inspired by Coleridge, T.S. Eliot, I. A. Richards, W. B. Yeats, and Auden, Brooks expounds the nature and function of poetry and the role of the poet. To him, poetry is an art, and the poet is an artist who seeks order and a meaningful pattern in the discordant and heterogeneous experiences of the world. The materials of poetry, namely language, literary conventions, ideas, and personal experiences, do not have an effect on the nature of poetry because they are conditioned and modified by the imagination and the experience of the poet. However, Brooks does not altogether negate the importance of biographical, moral, or social aspects of a poem because he believes that these aspects should be the means and not the end of the poem. Let's now look into what Brooks comments on the poet and the poetic process. In the poetic process, the poet does not follow a logical procedure like a carpenter or an architect. His work is completely organic, which means that he is continuously engaged in searching for wholeness. He is engaged in the practice of exploration, experimentation, and imagination in language. He unifies words, images, rhythms, local ideas, and events into a whole that indicates a distinct object. He is constantly engaged in discovering a pattern, and sometimes he is engaged in finding out what is concealed in a particular thought, experience or domain. In this respect, a poet differs from a scientist, historian, rhetorician or propagandist. Brooks considers that the task of the poet is to unify experience. The poet's job is not only to present certain truths eloquently and persuasively in terms of rich images and resonant harmonies, but also to render a total situation and the artistic vision of reality with the help of his language and imaginative sympathy. His duty is to neither lecture nor sermon nor perpetuate propaganda or reveal his emotions. As an active and responsible member of the society, the poet has to arouse people from their passive state into the full consciousness of their condition to let them comprehend reality. A poet is purely an artist who bears the responsibility of the society and presents the truth in general. Having said all this, Brooks then moves on into the form and content of a poem. He considers a poem to be an independent structure. All poems bear the common structural properties such as metaphor, paradox, irony, tone and attitude. In the traditional sense, form means poetic forms such as lyric, elegy, ode, ballad, sonnet among others, which are just like containers in which content is kept. Rejecting this concept of form, Brooks suggests examining a poem in terms of structure, not of content or subject matter. An examination of content deprives judging the beauty of the poem. Brooks contends that content and structure in a poem are inseparable. He dismisses Ransom's dualistic theory of structure and maintains that structure embodies an organic unity or harmony as well as the context. All the poems taken for study should be analyzed to reveal a relationship between the various parts and aspects of a poem, which may be a phrase, line, idea or image. It is this relationship in which the various parts of the poem unite together that constitute the structure of a poem. Hence, he then moves on to define what exactly is the structure of poem and where does unity come from. Unity in a poem is achieved through psychological, imaginative, dramatic processes. Logic and reason have no place for the total unity of the poem. Brooks' contention is that, I quote him, the essence of poetry is metaphor, and metaphor is finally ontological rather than logical, unquote. This leads to another important aspect of Brooks' notion of poetic structure, which is the notion that a poem cannot be paraphrased. Since a poem is an organic whole, similar to the human body or a plant, it cannot be translated or paraphrased. To paraphrase a poem, according to Brooks, is to disintegrate the parts as well as the whole of the poem, which includes metaphor, irony, ambiguity, tone, attitude, and as the experience of the poet. These parts would not convey meaning outside the poem and cannot be dealt with in isolation. There is a difference between the prose content that is paraphrased and the core of meaning that is contained in the structure of the poem. Paraphrase cannot account for complete meaning or total effect of a poem because the poem is autonomous, that comprises of the individual parts which are in absolute harmony with each other. Brooks' essays, The Language of Paradox, The Hearsay of Paraphrase, and Irony as a Principle of Structure embrace the main aspects of language and deal with the structure of his poetic theory. So far, we have just given you a background to the essay. Let us now move into the introduction to the essay, followed by the explication. The phrase hearsay of paraphrase is taken from the appendix attached to Cleon Brooks' influential book, The Well-Wrought Urn Studies in the Structure of Poetry, published in 1947. The hearsay of paraphrase is the essay at the end of Brooks' The Well-Wrought Urn. In the essay, Brooks points out the reason why he has undertaken a thorough interpretation of select 10 poems belonging to different movements and epochs, beginning from the metaphysical poet John Donne through Wordsworth and Lord Alfred Tennyson to W. B. Yeats and T. S. Eliot. The poems, representative of their age and tradition, are invaluable and they provide interesting reading. Brooks developed the notion of paraphrase in The Well-Wrought Urn Studies in the Structure of Poetry and condemned the practice of reducing a poem to a single narrative or didactic message. He depicted such a collective and reductionist reading of poetry to be hearsay and considered irony, paradox, ambiguity and other rhetorical and poetic devices suitable to present conflicting themes and divergent patterns of the text. The function of criticism, according to Brooks, is not to extract certain truths, find out rationales, place logical arguments or formulations about a poem. These practices, traditionally supposed to be the essential core of the poem itself, decrease the value assigned to criticism. The critics should be concerned about the role of language and how language functions to express certain ideas. If a critic's inclination is towards statements, it is derision of criticism. This conception acquires greater force when a poem is used as a tool for propaganda. In the vein of T. S. Eliot and John Crowe Ransom, Brooks condemns this mode of criticism. Let us now move into the essay. The metaphysical poets and the modern poets have a common poetic tradition, and the other masterpieces belonging to diverse periods and taken from different poetic modes of utterance can also be included within this tradition. The intention of including the 10 poems is neither to express a common theme nor to display some particular style of expression of the poets under study or to share a social set of symbols depicted, but to show how the different types of poetry have a common feature, which is the structure. It is sheer coincidence to have come across certain elements that these poems share. For instance, the light symbolism in Milton's La Allegro, Il Penseroso and Wordsworth's Immortality Ode, death as a matter of sex in John Donne's The Canonization and in Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, and the similarities of theme and problem in Wordsworth's Immortality Ode and W. B. Yeats' Among School Children. The most impressive point, according to Brooks, is that the 10 poems, without having much in common, are very close to the central stream of tradition of English poetry. Brooks discovers that the true worth of poetry cannot be stated in terms of content or subject matter, but only in terms of structure. The meaning or beauty of a poem never lies in a paraphrased content, statement, diction and imagery, but in its structure. Poetry can be studied only in terms of structure. However, it is unfortunate that the classicals and romantics read traditional poetry as statements, while only the metaphysicals and the modern poets followed the analytical technique. It is the general tendency of the people to paraphrase traditional poetry in order to understand and decipher meaning, while they ignore the real meaning of poetry of all types. This method of reading poetry was so deeply rooted in American universities and colleges that the teachers strongly protested against the introduction of Brooks' Understanding Poetry and the Well-Wrought Urn into the curriculum. However, they realized the value of these books, which affected the approach towards understanding and analyzing poetry. Brooks advocates that traditional poetry has much more in it than its paraphrased content, because the basic quality of the language of all poetry is paradox and irony. Classical and romantic poetry should also be read with the same analytical technique as metaphysical poetry and the moderns are done. In this way, a common similarity or tradition can be discovered in all types of poetry, including the metaphysical and the modern. To paraphrase romantic and classical poetry is to overlook the real meaning of poetry. Sound plays a pivotal role in determining human mind and behavior. The patterns of sounds, pauses and rhythm of the language of poetry condition, control and create various mental waves, psychological states and emotional feelings, whereas the paraphrased content fails to possess such characteristics. Brooks mentions that poetry must be described in terms of structure, and the paraphrased content of poetry never contains the real meaning. The meaning of poetry depends upon structure, and the structure depends on irony, paradox, ambiguity or complex of attitudes. Structure is far more internal than the metrical pattern or the sequence of images. Brooks mentions, I quote, "The structure obviously is everywhere conditioned by the nature of the material which goes into the poem. The nature of the material sets the problem to be solved, and the solution is the ordering of the material." Unquote. 2 points mentioned by Brooks regarding the structure of a poem are fundamental. First, Brooks' concept of structure is entirely different from that of John Crowe Ransom's. To Ransom, structure means the argument or content of the poem, which always remains detached from texture and forms a dual aspect of the poem. It is never used in the same sense as Brooks employs. Second, the meaning of structure does not denote form in the traditional sense. It is neither a kind of enclosure which contains the content, nor is it a form like an ode, elegy, sonnet and others in which ideas or subject matter are enclosed. That is why the structure of the poem, The Rape of the Lock, is definitely not a heroic couplet, the canto arrangement or the mock epic convention. The structure of the poem is found in the attitude that comprises of irony and paradox. Brooks comments, I quote him, "The structure meant is the structure of meanings, evaluations and interpretations, and the principle of unity which informs it seems to be one of the balancing and harmonizing connotations, attitudes and meanings." Unquote. On the basis of the study of the 10 poems, Brooks concludes that the core meaning of the poem depends upon the structure that depends on paradox, irony, ambiguity and complex of attitude. Brooks asserts that any good poem sets up against all attempts to paraphrase it. Most of the common heresies about poetry are born when the critic forms his misconception that the poem constitutes a statement which is completely misleading. The business of the critic is not to explore political, scientific or philosophical truths. His concern is not with the truth or falsity of a statement or its clarity, vagueness, eloquence or beauty of description. It is to be noted that this does not mean that the critic cannot describe adequately or accurately the general effect that the poem creates or about the poem. For instance, the poem The Rape of the Lock is about the follies and the foibles of the elite women of the 18th century British society. The effect of Corina's going a-maying is one of gaiety tempered by the poignancy of the transience of truth. Paraphrase can be used as a pointer or a shorthand reference. It is only an initial stage or the first step to predict the move of the critic and not the end of criticism. The poem has a structure and the structure comprises of a positive unity and an achieved harmony. It combines conflicting ideas, opposites and the discordant elements in the poem, producing an organic whole. That is why Brooks remarks, I quote him again, "The relation between all the elements must surely be an organic one. There can be no question about that." Unquote. The various elements are not arranged into a uniform grouping of the same qualities, but the structure unites the like with the unlike. The organic unity is not achieved by the reducing and simplifying of attitudes. Let us now summarize what we have done so far. Cleanth Brooks finds that people are influenced by heretical notions. He prepares to clarify these notions and prescribes the correct perspective of criticism. He points out the right method of reading, analyzing and teaching poetry. The function of criticism is to find out the role of language and how it functions and place to express certain ideas. If a critic gets tempted towards statements, he contaminates criticism. This misconception acquires more force when a poem is used as a tool for propaganda. Similar to T.S. Eliot and John Crowe Ransom, Brooks condemns such an approach to criticism. The Heresy of Paraphrase is the final essay in the Well-Wrought Urn, published in 1947. He points out the reason for a thorough interpretation of 10 poems selected from different movements and ages, ranging from the metaphysical poets to the moderns. The poems chosen are representative of their own age and tradition. He believes in the unity of a poem not as something mechanical, but as something organic, with each part modifying and in turn being modified by the whole. He believes that it is wrong to equate a poem with its prose meaning, which is its paraphrase. Poetry is not an abstract statement about experience, it is itself an experience. All this being said, we have questions for you to answer. which would help you understand the essay better. Until we meet in our next session with further ideas on what critics have to say about the essays that they have written, thank you.